I am very pleased and I'm very honored to be here, and I want to thank you very much for the invitation. This is my first visit to this wonderful city, but I hope it's not my last. I won't talk a lot about the future because I haven't been there. After the future is here, we can talk again and I'll tell you what the future is going to be like. But anybody who tells you what the future is like probably doesn't know anything about what the future really is. So I would just caution you about paying too much attention about those who tell you everything about what the future is going to do. I have been assigned a very difficult task of coming here to address this group on a very special occasion, which is the launching of your program. But more than that, I have been asked to follow the likes of Alan Rusbridger, who was here just a couple of weeks. And if you don't think that's a humbling experience, believe me, it truly is. So I thank you very much for the invitation to join you and a very distinguished panel of people who have been here. I say we just go to questions right now and forget this whole address after the very important comments that were made by the professors. But I did prepare this, so I'll go ahead.
Yeah,
So my many thanks to Professor Maceda, who we're very proud of as a graduate of Columbia University, who has come back here to run the master's program at the University of Torino. And I want to congratulate the students who just a couple of weeks ago began the program and who have chosen journalism as a profession. It will take no small amount of determination for you to succeed. It will take a great deal of a word I use as one of my favorite words in Spanish, ganas, which translates to mean desire, drive, determination, persistence, a will to succeed. It will also require that you constantly are learning and that you remain a student for your entire career. You've chosen a profession that is essential to our democracy, to our progress in our communities, and it is vital if we are going to hold people in power accountable. It's not going to be easy. Journalism never has been, really. I've done it for 30 years. It's never gotten any easier. The hours are long, and they're very grueling. The pay, it's always been lousy. It's always going to be lousy for most people. The government does not support you. In fact, it will put barriers in your way, and you will use those ganas to get around the barriers. The public is not going to support you. Most people in the public don't like you. Even though good journalism is what they are benefiting from. They are the primary beneficiaries of great journalism. They're not going to respect your work, even though they are the beneficiaries. For some of you, depending on what you do, your assignments are going to put you in danger, but you will do them anyway. And of course, none of your parents want you to be journalists. So this is what you face. So when you come to us and you enroll in schools and you say you want to be a journalist, it tells me you've got a lot of guns. You've got that will, and that's a wonderful thing. So Professor Maceda asked me to come here and speak about training. Who needs to get training? What skills are important? Who should be trained? And how does that happen? I have 4 questions that I always ask recruits to ask themselves when they think about going to journalism school, whether it's to my school, your school, Northwestern, to any school that you're thinking about. And they have to be very, very introspective and critical and very honest with themselves. But this is what they need to ask themselves. First, what is my goal? What is my goal? My short-term goal, my long-term goal? What is it that I want to do as a journalist? What do I know now that I can do? What do I know how to do? What are my capabilities? What are my skills that I have already? What do I still need to learn to meet my goals? What do I lack? What are the skills that I have to go out and still acquire? And then you have to ask yourself, how and where am I going to learn these skills? Who is going to teach me? These are questions actually for anyone. We have students here, we have veteran journalists, we have people who are working in all the media companies in Italy and United States and Latin America and all the continents, who should be asking themselves this question all the time. I said you should be students for the rest of your lives, for the rest of your careers. Anyone in any newsroom should be a student for the rest of their careers, constantly learning new things. It should never ever stop. And when it does stop, your career really will stop. So these questions really are relevant for anyone at any stage, because we are in a state of revolution and evolution, as Mr. Rusbridger told you so very eloquently a couple of weeks ago. We're going to remain that way forever. But we've always been in something of an evolutionary stage, maybe more rapidly now than we have in past years, but it continues. So for many reasons, we're going to always be changing it. And one of the key reasons is that we have so many more people who are coming into this business. They are our competitors. They may never step into a classroom and learn anything about journalism from a professor, but they will call themselves journalists. I don't know where any of you live, but your neighbor to your left, your neighbor to your right. One of them is a journalist. They're a blogger. They're posting on social media in what they feel is an independent website that produces news. It produces information. That's different from journalism. That's different from what we do. That's the distribution of information that may or may not be up to the standards that we've been discussing here, whether those standards are implied or they are imposed by an association, by a school, or by the people in the newsroom. But they are there, and they are our competitors, and we have to learn to deal with them by understanding them. Not necessarily mimicking them or trying to do what they do, but by understanding them and doing our jobs even better. Had Professor Mosera asked me very simply to answer whether or not training is necessary, this would be a really short speech because I'd answer in simply one word: yes. Of course, and you've heard that already from the discussion by the professors who spoke before me. But when you start answering the question of what skills and what training, who should provide it, what kind of education, where do you go, that becomes really more complex. Who pays for this? And that's a difficult question to start thinking about. You know, it becomes even more shaded when you think about how many of the institutions that had existed previously are no longer around here to be able to provide the kind of journalism that we have always known about. Both for students and for beginning career journalists, the answer is really the same. Never stop learning, as we've said. But who provides that training is really at the heart of the question, and you've already heard that. Should the media companies, who will be the beneficiaries of improved work by more skilled, better trained journalists, assume the cost of investing in their workforces? The answer to that, very clearly in my mind, is yes. Is it going to happen? Probably not. So who should be paying? Should the people in the newsroom themselves invest in themselves? Yeah, to the extent they can. I understand the economics of journalism, and when you have a company that's barely making its payroll, one of the things they're not going to think very much about is how to spend money to send people off to journalism schools, to training workshops, to learn things. But it should be a priority in every way that's possible. It should be a very high priority for companies to train their workforces, whether they're the beginners or they're the people who are the journeymen. For generations now, journalism schools, in fact, have taken in students who are very eager to learn about our craft. We've taught them in ways that prepare them for what the industry has wanted. We have been the ones who somewhat set the agenda for what the industry was going to do. We would teach them to cover crime on deadline, write about teachers in education and schools. We would ask them to do investigations on City Hall to hold public officials accountable for their misdeeds, to report on candidates seeking election to public office. They would use shoe leather reporting for every other kind of breaking news that might happen. Students would graduate, they'd go out, they'd find jobs in newsrooms doing this work. They would be led by veterans who had done the same thing for many years out in the streets themselves. Our schools provided what the industry said was needed. Veterans would continue to work for years doing what they learned in journalism school many years prior, or they might just learn on the job. They'd learn what was needed from their colleagues, many of whom themselves had learned on the job. Well, technology is kind of turning all of that on its ear. In a generation, in very simply a generation and a short generation, and a very fast-moving generation, journalism companies have been transformed completely from top to bottom. In the United States alone, in the last 20 years, we have lost almost 200 daily newspapers. Those are millions of readers a day. From more than 1,400 daily newspapers in 1996, with about 56,000 journalists, more or less, we're down to about 1,200 newspapers, with about 33,000 newsroom journalists. In the United States, we have seen similar contraction in television broadcasting sector. At the same time, however, we are in the midst of an explosion in the digital sector. And some of it affects some of these same companies that have contracted or gone out of business in their early stages before they closed. We have no idea really how many of these sites exist because there is no structure to accurately measure or monitor them in the way that the newspaper and the broadcasting sectors had for years. All of the subjects they cover or how many people they are writing for, we don't really know about. We just know that there are lots and lots of them, there are more coming, and the number grows daily. That growth in the digital sector, and especially in the social media platforms, which have to some degree taken over the news media industry, where so much news is already posted. Many people are led to believe that they would save journalism, that this digital revolution rather would save journalism. It hasn't really translated to that extent. It's not the panacea that many people expected. Technology has not resolved the problem that we face in journalism. A recent report that was published by the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, which is based at Columbia University in New York City, and studies digital issues, cited industry statistics and pointed to the fact that in surveys, only 6 out of 10 people they questioned said that they had been reading the stories, that only 6 out of 10 were reading only the headlines on what they were seeing either on websites or on social media. Only 6 out of 10 people, okay? They weren't reading the stories, they were reading the headlines. You heard a few minutes ago about how important those headlines are. They are. But the headlines can be as good as you want to make them, but if people aren't going to click on them and don't have interest in reading them, have interest only in reading the headline and then sharing the headline without knowing what the story is really about, it doesn't solve the problem. On Twitter, that report showed, from the Tao Center, it's even worse. It showed that there's only 10% click-through. That means 90% of the headlines are never read. 90% of the people don't ever see what that story really says. We could go on with statistics for many of the other platforms like Facebook and Instagram and media platforms like WhatsApp and others, and the results will be equally devastating. This is further evidence that social media, which everybody thought would solve the problem for journalism, or was one of the panacea, isn't working. In fact, some media companies in some parts of the world have pulled away from social media entirely. For instance, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, Folha de Sao Paulo, a major newspaper, has decided it will no longer put its headlines on Facebook for a variety of reasons. One, it wasn't resulting in people coming to their paper, it was distracting people from coming to their paper, and we've seen with tons of evidence that there's so much manipulation of views on Facebook, they did not want to be associated with that platform. They've been followed by a number of other major publications around the world. A terrible consequence of all these changes is that in many newsrooms, we are no longer finding the veterans, in fact, who could teach the generations that are to come, even if we wanted them all to learn on the job. On-the-job training is something that was very important to very many people, and it remains important. I'm not here to suggest that learning from your colleagues on the job is a bad thing. It's great when they have something to teach you, if they know how to do those jobs. So many of the editors who have taken over as newspaper, television, and network directors and editors, digital sites, and other media outlets, as they've been reconfigured, or even considered created from scratch, were great at reporting, but they never had the training to be editors, to be leaders, to be people who would be the teachers for the new generation. So our beginners are learning in journalism school in a year or two and getting a start. It isn't their entire journalism education, of course, and then they go into newsrooms and they're left on their own. That's a terrible thing to happen. Today, we are training beginners with skills that are not yet in use in many newsrooms even. So while we set the agenda now with what we are training students to do in some journalism schools when it comes to technology, use of algorithms, computer programming, and use of social media to use as a reporting tool, they're going into newsrooms where editors don't know how to do these things yet. They're left on their own. There isn't anybody really to train them on the job. So they don't have a way to really continue that education except by hit and miss. In a very fast-paced world of information, credibility and reliability have become increasingly difficult to navigate also. In the words of a professor from West Virginia, Marshall University, Tisha Bumgarner, she is a documentary filmmaker who teaches students and has for a number of years. She'll be coming to my school next summer to learn investigative reporting skills. She puts it this way, quote, "It takes critical thinking skills in order to judge information both received and distributed." Two-way street. To this, information created through investigative journalism alone in contemporary society is a necessity with each new story about corruption and wrongdoing by those in power. We teach students to be information gatherers, thinkers, media makers. We teach young journalists to think critically in order to discover the multiple details of stories, as multiple truths lie within these details. This happens within multiple avenues of storytelling, such as journalism, news broadcast, and documentary making. It's more complicated than it ever was before. So what does this mean to all of you as journalists, either beginners or veterans? Where and what are the very direct implications for you in the future? Well, we began hearing a little bit about data and programming and technology. And that's kind of where we begin. Because these are tools and skills that are used as for story discovery, for reporting, and for collecting information, and for storytelling. It's all about storytelling. It's created one of the strongest reasons why journalists, from beginners to veterans, should always continue their learning and their training. Veronica Bernatsky, who's a fellow at the Town Center, recently released a report looking at the challenges, the legal challenges resulting from the use of technology and data. And what she says is journalists are quickly learning how to obtain troves of data through electronic leaks, through drones, and cutting-edge computer programs that sometimes require little more than a click of a button to access information. In other instances, journalists confronted with processing large swaths of information must employ complicated algorithmic and programming skills. Many larger news organizations have even built internal digital programs and tools to sort through that data swells and leaks, as was done with the Panama Papers. It wasn't done, and it isn't being done in all newsrooms, unfortunately. Jeff Bezos, who last year in the Future of Newspaper conference, I believe it was last year.
He was here, yeah.
Who owns Amazon and who bought the Washington Post, sees data as a game changer entirely. He says, newspapers should become technology companies. Stories that have that are developed with the use of data, reporting on important events and topics using data, will drive subscriptions and will be attractive to readers. That leads to readers willing to pay for that kind of journalism. He's probably right. I hope he is. That's an easy thing for the richest guy in the world to say, but I think he's right. At Columbia Journalism School and at other schools, we're teaching students to search for, to acquire, study, to interrogate, again, interrogate massive data sets using algorithms to find answers in the data. They begin their stories, the discovery of ideas for what they will write in the data. They learn to use programs like Python, like R, C++. They use tools like SCL and processing tools like Open and Refine and Tableau to clean and reorder data and analyze it and question it again, and question it again, and question it again. So they can find stories and answers and raise more questions in mountains of numbers that otherwise would just be a mountain of numbers. In the Panama Papers project that was completed 2 years ago and won a Pulitzer Prize, more than 350 journalists from around the world in 150 news organizations. They worked with 11 million documents that were made available in a dozen different formats. None of these documents in these different formats could speak to each other. They had no way of cross-referencing this information. A project of this magnitude had never been attempted before. There have been other smaller projects with much less data. Journalists teamed, and over time, they collaborated to find ways to get these documents on as close a platform as possible so that they could correlate all this information, so that databases could be analyzed more closely. There could be cross-references between the information coming from many, many different types of data in different formats. It's been used since many times in different projects. The cruise ship industry has been analyzed and examined very closely in a project that we worked on in collaborating with 4 different other news organizations at the University of Columbia. Pollution in your schools has been examined using collaborations. The implant industry, a worldwide industry that imposes billions and billions of dollars in cost to patients worldwide, was recently examined in the recent project released by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, using many of these same types of skills that they learned in the Panama Papers project. Offshore tax havens around the world have been examined using the same kind of technology. And there are many more types of projects where collaborations between newspapers, digital sites, magazines, broadcast outlets, radio and television were created. The development, the use of, the creation of algorithms, learning to write them, to use them in sorting and interrogating data, and detecting falsehood by speakers such as the President of the United States, and knowing how to reverse engineering them so that you can understand how a story that you see elsewhere was conceived and put together, is a skill that provides a very powerful tool for story development. Outlets like the Washington Post are utilizing apps like Truth Teller to detect lies in speeches and documents. Glenn Kessler is a reporter there who for weeks had been using this tool, using pure algorithms, numbers, looking for little bits and pieces of information in stories. He used it and tested it for weeks, and when the president recently made a speech about the defense industry, he applied this algorithm and instantly knew that there was a lot of information that was purely false or misleading in what the president was saying. Simple algorithm. But it took critical thinking on his part to understand why that was important. We're also in the depth, deep in the midst of a digital multimedia world. The use of video and audio to enhance reporting and storytelling is crucial and key to being competitive. It's how people today want to get their news very often, particularly on mobile applications. But at the same time, understanding how disinformation and efforts at manipulation of the news are carried out, and knowing how to use verification tools to detect fraudulent information in video and audio has become a standard practice in many newsrooms. It's a necessity. It's not something that was easily learned on the job. Across the globe, including in Italy, in fact, verification projects have been formed. There are conferences where hundreds and hundreds of people involved in fact-checking and verification projects have come together to learn and exchange information. Many people are using programs like InVid to detect fraud and manipulation of video projects, using metadata and other search tools. In video files and photographs that have been altered. One of the most famous was a young girl who was a victim of a shooting in Florida. She was shown ripping up the Constitution because she wanted to defy gun advocates, the advocates for guns. It was fake. It was false. It was instantly detected by some of these tools. But that is going on and on and on. So these are tools that you have to learn in the newsroom. It's a necessity, just like any of the other basics that you have. Protecting yourself and your work and your sources against the real menace of cyber thieves and infiltration by hackers is also becoming a necessity. We have entire courses that we're teaching in our class, in our school on how to do this. If you want to be really frightened, think about how often hackers are trying to break into your computers. When you travel, whether it's nationally, internationally, you're taking laptops with you. I've got one in my backpack right now. I've got my life in it. Probably not a good idea, but I'm traveling in pretty safe places. Italy is a pretty safe place, right? But I travel to a place that's in conflict, a war zone, or a place where maybe it's very dangerous because of other elements, or it's a very hostile regime. I'm certain to be searched. My laptop may be confiscated. Everything on it is going to be searched. I may get the material back, but it's going to be looked at by other people. You need to know how to encrypt your files, how to transmit information between you and your colleagues. A source sends you information. How do you protect that source? How do you tell someone, send me this document, don't worry about it, no one's ever going to know. Every stitch, every time you hit the keyboard, you leave a footprint. You need to know how to make that happen, how sources can deal with you, how you can interact with them, and not put them in danger so they aren't exposed. This isn't something that's necessarily learned on the job. People in the job don't know how to do this necessarily. They should be learning how to do this. So again, you get that question, who should be learning, how should you be learning it? And there are lots of institutions that teach this. One of the best is something called the Freedom of the Press Foundation in New York. But there are lots of other institutions that are doing this worldwide. So keep this in mind and be scared, be very scared. Engaging with audiences, talking to your readers, and using what they know as a source for discovering stories and getting information that will provide for better storytelling. I was very fortunate to sit at dinner with Alan Rusbridger recently in Oxford at the Reuters Institute, which he heads. We had a long conversation about social media. Among his pet peeves is that journalists have never learned really how to talk to the audiences that we cultivate and we bring into our news sites. We don't know how to ask them questions. We don't know how to have a conversation with them. They have enormous amounts of information, and we need to learn how to harvest that by talking to them, by engaging with them on the social media platforms. They live on their phones, they live on their applications, they live in their devices, and we need to understand how they do that. We need to understand what they're reading, when they're reading it, how much they're reading it. What most people know about social media now is how to create an account, how to post really fast, how to post as often as possible about some kind of meal you're about to eat, how pretty it is. You know, this is a really great meal, here's a picture of it. Poof, seconds later it's on your Instagram and you can eat, but you can't eat until you show the whole meal. That's what most people know about social media. They don't know how to have a conversation with a reader who might be able to provide them with information about their own personal story that can contribute information, critical information, about a topic you're investigating. ProPublica, a digital website started 10 years ago in New York City, strictly for investigative reporting, is one of the very best in doing this. When they do an investigation, it's very much unlike what used to be done in the old days, where investigative reporters would hide in the corner. No one would ever know what they were working on until a Sunday morning when their story would hit the front page. Then everyone knew what they were working on. ProPublica will tell you, we're investigating the healthcare industry. Send us your stories. Here's a Dropbox where you can send us your documents. They'll be protected. No one's going to know. And they have technology that will guarantee that. People will send them their information, their health records, their doctor's memos, their insurance records. They'll put their name, their phone number, their address, their email contact. 35,000 submissions later on, they've got an enormous database upon which they can feed. They start analyzing that. This is how they have a conversation. They go to these people and they use them in their storytelling. This is something they've learned and acquired through programming skills, through people who have done hit and miss. They've done experiments using different kinds of technology. They're engaging with their audiences, and it's become a very powerful tool. These are things that you need to learn to do. This means also knowing your audiences, how they have altered their reading habits, how they access the news, who's reading your work, when, how much, how often, on which devices. Technology can tell you right now, today, how many people are reading La Stampa. In the newsroom yesterday, they had chart B on their screen, and we could see how many people had read which story, which was the most popular. Technology can tell you where those people are, almost down to exactly the person, using IP addresses. It can also tell you how much time they spent reading that story. It can tell you how much they've gone into that story. And you read this far, to the 15th paragraph, all the way to the end. How many people have gotten to the end of that story? This is all information that's very important, particularly for the people who run the newspapers, who are dealing with the finances, who are having to deal with advertisers who are asking how many people are reading your stories, really reading your stories. Because I'm going to pay for ads on pages where people are actually reading the stories and actually visiting and spending some time, not just passing through. Clickbait doesn't interest them anymore. We're past that stage. Many people are convinced that the future of news media is tethered to mobile devices. They're probably right. That may be true. You know, a recent Reuters Digital News Project survey showed that more than half of the people they had surveyed in 4 countries in North America, in a quick survey that was in North America, Europe, and Asia, were interested in receiving notifications about news events on their mobile devices. They weren't just using mobile devices, but they were to the point where they actually wanted to actively be getting notices about news events. So all of this means knowing how to use metrics, how to understand these numbers once you get them about readers and audiences. Analytics, audience data, how it's used by your companies to determine what's covered and how. You know, word of caution. You don't want your editors, your publishers, the owners of a newspaper saying, this is a story that's going to get lots of clicks, so let's go cover this kind of news. Maybe that's not the most important news to cover. These are decisions that are carefully made, hopefully, in newsrooms, sometimes not so carefully, but it's being used in many instances to make decisions about what gets covered. Maybe it's going to be a trivia story, but you know it's going to get lots of traffic, so maybe we should cover that. Maybe this important story about schools, curriculums, the scandal, the amount of money that's being spent by this agency here in the wrong way is a far more important story. Maybe more time and effort needs to be put into that story. Probably not as many people are going to read it, but maybe that's going to lead to a higher quality, more credibility, more trust in your publication. and maybe that's going to lead to more people wanting to subscribe to your website. So these are decisions that somebody is making someplace using all this information. And it behooves you to know how they're doing this. Google Analytics, Chartbeat, Nielsen, and many other internal digital accounting systems are being used now to track all of this, whose stories are read, and where all this traffic is coming from. In our school, we teach a class each spring so that our students can understand this. We teach them the basics, the blocking and tackling that you heard about before, the reporting basics, how to go out and find a story, to do the interviews, and so forth. But we also want them to understand the world of media that they're going into. They have to understand the environment that they're going to be part of. So we teach a course. It's required. Every student who comes to our school has to go through this. It's not about how to become a publisher or an editor, but how to understand the business, the principles that govern the media world, as well as newer concepts like audience building and technology adaptation so that you can use it for better storytelling. These are not skills that are intuitive to most journalists unless they consciously study them. And they won't know what these skills really are until they learn them. Also, you know, the digital world has opened us up to be citizens of the world. I published a story right here in Torino. It's instantly readable in Argentina, in Greenland, in the Philippines, in Minnesota, in the United States. You can read it on the space shuttle in space if you want. Everything you're publishing online essentially now is open to the entire world. That's a great thing, right? It is to a certain degree. It's opened up legal challenges also, because in some countries, what you publish in another place might make you vulnerable to lawsuits. These are legal challenges that you need to understand. It doesn't mean you stop doing that story. You report it as the truth, you make it as solid as possible, you publish it. If someone else in another place has a problem with that, you'll have to sort that out with legal counsel in your own companies. But you need to understand what those challenges are, because it may mean that you report your story in a little bit different way, maybe you publish it in a little bit different way, and maybe you collaborate with people in different places so that you've got backup. If your site is shut down because of laws that are imposed by a particular regime, you've got that site, that story still published in another site that's going to say that aren't necessarily governed by the laws of a particular regime. This is what a number of country institutions in Latin America have done. They've collaborated on projects and they published these stories in a number of websites in different countries, because in some of those regimes, the rules are so imposing that they've attempted to shut down these sites just to close down the stories. They're still visible in other places. That's a backup. You need to understand that this is what's happening. All of these skills, data, social media, audience engagement, programming, algorithms, video, they have no value. They're worthless. There are no benefits, comma, unless you're using them for better storytelling. Now, this may sound like a contradiction to everything I've just said, but it's not. I talk about these things as a way to find stories, to develop better stories, and to develop better storytelling. These are tools that you use for gathering more information to make your stories, to make your journalism better. That should be the end goal of everything you're learning to do in your career, whether you're starting out or you're a veteran. You want these stories and you want these tools to be used in telling stories to find more truth, to find the truth, accurately, fairly, and completely. That's your job as a journalist. And the moment you stop being a student of this profession, that's when you stop evolving, and that's really when you stop being a quality journalist. Don't let that happen, because journalism isn't going to happen, isn't going to do that either. So thank you very much for being here.